my conversations with English gentlemen, I have found it was in vain to combat their sentiment. The so-called anti-slavery feeling seems to have become with them a sentiment akin to patriotism. I've always told them that in the South, we could rely confidently that after independence, when our people and theirs became better acquainted by direct communication, when they saw for themselves the true condition of the African servitude with us, the film would fall from their eyes, and that in the meantime, it was not presumptuous to suppose that we knew better than they did what to do in our affairs. Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And I'm David Olusoga.
And David, that rather arrogant note was part of a dispatch that was sent from Paris, in fact, at the beginning of January 1864 to J.P. Benjamin, who was then the Secretary of State to the Confederate States of America.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that note, isn't there?
There's a whole lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Now, the author of that letter was a Confederate commissioner named James Mason, a diplomat who we discussed in our last episode. He had been sent to Europe in 1861. After a little hiccup, he managed to get there. We talked about the hiccup.
Almost causing war between Britain and America. But he made it. He was released and he made it to Britain, and he's in Paris by 1864. And he's basically giving up, really, isn't he?
Yeah. So he picks up his diplomatic mission after the interval. He gets there and he's trying to persuade the British, the French, other European nations to recognize the Confederate States as a sovereign nation in their war against the United States, to maybe come in as an ally. And as you said, this is 1864. So this is 3 years later. He's been trying for 3 years, and he's given up on the British because he's admitting back home to his government that the British will never support the slaveholding Confederacy.
Yeah, he says something really important, which I think is absolutely accurate for the moment he's living in the 1860s, that anti-slavery feeling in Britain has become akin to patriotism, that part of being British is to be opposed to slavery and the slave trade, and that by 1864, that meant that Britain was never going to support the Confederacy. But that's 1864. We left the story at the beginning of 1862. And this is the last of our 3 programs on the relationship between Britain and the United States during those difficult years of the Civil War. And 1862, which is where we're up to, is in many ways a critical year.
We've been talking throughout about the Confederacy's great gamble, that cotton would give them the leverage that they needed to persuade Britain to come in on the American Civil War on their side.
Yeah. If we go back to the eve of the Civil War, the years leading up to it, Southern strategists had imagined that if they withheld the cotton that they produced, that was 3/4 of the cotton at the center of the British cotton industry, if they kept that out of the global market, Britain would be forced to recognize their independence. And we talked about the famous speech by Senator James Hammond in 1858, that cotton could bring the whole world to its knees. It would topple Britain and the whole civilized world because cotton, and this is the famous phrase, cotton is king. One of the great craziest gambles in all of history, that you can bring down the world by not exporting cotton.
It was a conviction that was so firmly held. It wasn't just the Confederate government who believed this. Plantation owners in the South had also got high on their own supply, as we would say today, and thought, well, actually, we can do our part by forcing Britain to recognize the Confederacy if we don't send them the cotton. So we will withhold the cotton that they need, and then they'll come begging.
Yeah, they genuinely thought they were playing their part in forcing Britain into this war by not sending the cotton from their estate produced by the enslaved people that they owned as property. There are photographs that were taken in the 1860s, the heyday when photography is really beginning to explode as a new technology. There are amazing photographs of thousands of bales of cotton rotting by the docks of Savannah, Georgia, and Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, Louisiana.
It seems like a kind of self-defeating strategy. I mean, this is the basis of their economy, too. They're going to be relying on international trade to see them through the war.
And they could have adopted that strategy. I mean, this is the thing about the cotton is king gamble. There's two ways of doing it. One is you withhold the cotton from the global markets and force people to come in on your side, or that you sell as much as you possibly can. You try to get as much cotton as you possibly can to Europe so you can buy guns and boots and blankets and food and all the things you need to fight a war against the North, which is much more industrial, has lots of advantages and a bigger population. It is strange that they choose that strategy.
Yeah. The South is miscalculating in more ways than one, because with all of this grand strategy of cotton is king, there's something kind of obvious that they've forgotten about, which is what the North might do in response to their going to war.
Yeah, the South are right about one thing. An economic weapon, as well as a ballistic weapon, is going to be critical to this war. But it's the North, not the South, that cuts off the supply of cotton to Europe.
So there's, the South saber rattling and going, well, we're going to control our supply, forgetting that Lincoln can just intervene and go, no, you're not.
Yeah.
You're not going to control anything.
Yeah. The blockade is in some ways one of the kind of most powerful stories of the Civil War. The Union ships, not that effectively at first, but growing more effective as the war goes on, cuts off supplies of material from Europe and prevents southern cotton from reaching Europe. The blockade reduced the amount of southern cotton reaching the key port in England, Liverpool, by 95 or 96% from its pre-war levels.
But forgetting that the North could set up blockades wasn't the South's only miscalculation.
The problems with the king cotton theory, I mean, there's two big issues with it. The first is that they'd forgotten that it was in the interest of the North to prevent the cotton getting through. The other thing is, and this is even dumber, they've been talking about it publicly, loudly, aggressively for years. They'd been banging on about it since the 1850s. So the mill owners in Britain looked at the United States as a politically unstable nation and therefore an unreliable trading partner. So they did a few things. I mean, these are very competent capitalists. So they stockpile US cotton. They always like to have a lot of cotton on standby anyway. That had been made easier for them because the crops in the Deep South in 1859 and 1860 had been some of the best crops ever. 1861 had been another good year. So the South went to war wanting to use the global supply of cotton as an economic weapon at a time of oversupply.
When for years they'd been saying we might use this as an economic weapon and giving everybody plenty of time and plenty of resource to stockpile as much as they needed. Threatening boycott at a time of oversupply is not the canniest strategy.
No, to go to war on the threat of a boycott at a time of oversupply. It's like coal miners going on strike in summer. It's like Ben and Jerry's going on strike in November. It's pretty dumb.
And it's not just Britain. There are therefore huge stocks of cotton all over the world market at this point.
Not only do they have stockpiles, there's unsold cotton on the world market. And the British, again, recognizing their vulnerability to America, recognizing America on this issue of slavery is becoming an unstable nation, they'd started to diversify. In the 1850s, British merchants had invested in cotton production in Egypt. Next time you buy Egyptian cotton sheets, there's no reason for that because British money, British capital went into Egyptian cotton production. The British also invested in cotton in India. British capital poured into Brazil. Again, cotton produced again by enslaved people, just as in the South. Slavery doesn't end in Brazil until 1888. There's even British money going into cotton production in the Ottoman Empire.
So the other miscalculation is if cotton is king, is thinking that South is the only place in the world where it could possibly be produced.
Yeah, there's so much wrong with this thinking. However, there was also a flaw in the thinking of the British merchants who had been stockpiling cotton, who weren't worried about the South, and that is that they had presumed that the war would be short, that the North, with all its advantages, all its industrial power, its bigger population, would absolutely crush the South. So by the end of 1861, around the time of the Trent crisis, the stockpiles of raw cotton were running low. The cotton on the world market had all been bought up. And in 1862, there starts to be a serious crisis. The level of imports of cotton coming from the South, getting through the Northern Union blockade, was 4% of its pre-war levels. And the 2,500 mills of Lancashire are in trouble by spring, summer 1862. By October 1862, 58% of Lancashire's mills had no cotton.
So what did they do?
Well, these are really valuable workers. The mill owners understand that the people who work in the mills, men and women and also children, that they are skilled, and that if you just get rid of them, which they have every power to do. I mean, there's no employment laws in Britain in the 1860s or anywhere in the 1860s. You might never be able to reassemble those people with those skills in those towns to work in your mills. So at first, they just try to cut hours. They try to make sure that maybe one person in a family has a job so that at least there's some money coming in. These are relatively well-paid communities, and they can absorb a little bit of financial shock. They're not straight away in a starvation situation. So the effect is slow, but it is all going in one direction. By the end of 1862, 70% of the mill workers, 312,200 people, the majority of them women, are out of work. And what we have is a phase in British industrial history called the Lancashire cotton famine, which is a really, really powerful term, that the supply of cotton, when it's cut off, that they use the word famine to describe it. I always thought really is a really powerful term.
Well, but the numbers that you're describing, David, make clear why that's not an exaggeration, right? If 70% of your workforce is out of work, then, you're going to have the conditions of famine, right? So people are going to leave home looking for work. People are going to emigrate. It's a desperate situation.
Yeah, you have all of those effects. People don't starve, but all of the other effects of people being scattered, that takes place. There are charity drives and there are soup kitchens. People are marching from town to town because there might be some work in the mill in the next town. And some people took the last of their money, and there's a real irony in this, and they bought tickets to get to New York or to another harbor in the north.
As you're saying, this all happens at the end of 1862. For those who do this over the next 6 months or so, if they arrived in the north after March 1863, then they actually arrived after what was called the Enrollment Act, which was automatic conscription. So you're going to get enlisted into the army and go fight against the South.
Yeah, they're hardly an escape from the American Civil War to end up in the Union Army.
But staying in Britain wasn't much of an escape either.
No, I mean, the people have to fall back on the English Poor Law, which is a pretty brutal system.
We've talked about that
in
before
the 1860s
too.
We have, yeah. And it looked like the threat of King Cotton as the ultimate economic weapon that could cause chaos in Britain. It looked like some of that was true by the last months of 1862. Even
though it wasn't the Confederates doing it, it was the Union blockades that were actually withholding the cotton. But it was indeed looking like it was going to topple Britain.
And there is a moment of wavering. We've talked about support for the North, opposition to slavery. But there is a moment in 1862-63 when the British cabinet kind of vacillates under Prime Minister Lord Palmerston. There were discussions about whether Britain should or could recognize the South or intervene in some way in the American Civil War.
Well, the war was dragging on, right? I mean, it was lasting much longer than anyone, including, most Americans, had envisioned. So if you can't see the end in sight and you are at this point the biggest empire in the world, you know that if you actually weigh in, you can potentially change the outcome. So you can see why that was a calculus they would consider.
And there were people in the cabinet like Gladstone, who is the Chancellor, who has some sympathy with the South. I mean, they look at the South and they see this somewhat aristocratic society of large landowners who say they believe in free trade. And to some members of the British elite, they see kinship in the South. It also has to be said that the Gladstone family were the biggest owners of enslaved people in the British Empire at the abolition of slavery in 1833. So it's not hard to see that there were other reasons why Gladstone himself personally might have been more conciliatory towards the South. But there was a humanitarian case made that this deadly war that would cost many more lives than people had imagined, that Britain could use its good offices to bring about, mediate peace. Some sort of way out with honour was possible if the British got involved. However, some sort of deal with the Confederacy meant some sort of accommodation of slavery.
But despite these vacillations, as you say, in fact, as we know, Britain did not come into the war in 1862, particularly not on the side of the Confederates. And that's partly because of the events in the war itself, which we haven't been talking about that much at the end of 1862. Part of the reason that the war was dragging on was because the Union not only was not sailing to easy victory the way that so many people had predicted, it had in fact suffered catastrophic early losses. It had real problems with generalship. But after a rocky start, their military position started to strengthen.
The autumn of 1862 really is the moment that the war changes, with battles that I don't think mean very much to most people on this side of the Atlantic, but I know will be etched into your imagination and your education as an American.
They're absolutely iconic. So on the 17th of September, 1862, the North wins, barely, ekes out a victory at the Battle of Antietam. Antietam is still the bloodiest single day in American history. It was an appalling
Antietam
battle.
for America is what the first day of the Somme is to Britain.
That's exactly
a day
right.
of catastrophe.
Yeah, carnage. But it was, unlike the Somme, it was a turning point. It wasn't a decisive victory that changed everything, but it checked Confederate momentum. And crucially, what it did was it gave Lincoln the space that he needed to act.
Yeah. It showed to people watching from Europe that the North was ultimately going to win this war. And as you say, but it allowed Lincoln to do something which really changed momentum, which was to transform the meaning of the war.
We said last time that Lincoln did not campaign on the abolition of slavery because it wasn't an electorally popular position at the beginning of the war. But obviously, over the course of the war, those attitudes are also starting to change. And Lincoln decides, crucially, that he can make arguments beyond just defending the Union, which was what his position had always been, that the South didn't have the right to secede. And now he wants to widen the Union cause. And just 5 days after Antietam, he issues an incredibly important announcement.
And this is the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
So people who are familiar with the Emancipation Proclamation will know that it's actually issued on January 1st, 1863. The reason it can be on that clean New Year's Day, that first day of 1863, is because he'd already tested the water. And the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation sets out what the terms of emancipation during the war are going to be. We said when we talked about the March on Washington, in 1963, that very crucially, the Emancipation Proclamation did not emancipate all of the enslaved people in America. What it did was emancipate the slaves who were held within the states in a condition of open rebellion against the Union. Again, Lincoln is being political. He's thinking about all kinds of political calculuses, but in the minds of people around the world, this is the moment when the United States finally abolishes slavery.
And for people in Britain, and this goes back to the quote that we had at the top, this is the moment when the war unambiguously becomes a war against slavery. It becomes just politically impossible, unimaginable that a British government could support or recognize the Confederacy now that Lincoln has made this a war against slavery, when anti-slavery abolition is part, the essence, to an extent, of British national identity, particularly in its relationship with America in the 19th century. Because I mean, to take a step back to thinking about the nature of this relationship, this unspecial relationship in the 19th century, one of the things that the British enjoyed about their relationship with America is between 1833 and the abolition of slavery and 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation, Britain could say, we are the moral light of the world. We have abolished slavery and you have not. We have led the world in a moral direction. Our ships are off the coast of Africa suppressing the slave trade. So Britain not only sees abolition as part of its identity, it sees it as something which makes it distinct and morally superior to the United States. So this is America joining Britain in this great global war against slavery. You know, the war has changed militarily, but my God, the war has changed morally at this moment.
As well as a principled position, it's also a great political move, because what he does is he boxes in the Confederacy. He completely preempts them. And at the same time, not only does it now mean that Britain will never join on the side of the Confederacy, or very unlikely, it also makes it harder for France to come in and support the Confederacy as well. So Lincoln has really outmaneuvered the South at this point.
I mean, there are two things going on at the same time. Antietam is a very strong indication that the North ultimately will win. It's not going to be pretty, but they're probably going to win. And now, 5 days later, he changes this into not just a war, not just a civil war, but a moral war, a crusade against the evil of slavery.
But although this has changed the political calculus in Britain, it hasn't changed the economic reality of the cotton famine that we're talking about.
No. If you're a Lancashire mill worker, you're one of those 4 million people in Britain who relied on the cotton industry. It's very meaningful to people, many of whom are abolitionists, that this war is now a moral war. But that doesn't put food on the table. That doesn't mean you have work. That doesn't miraculously change your financial conditions. And so Britain is still in this position where it needs to try to find ways of limiting the damage of the fact that the cotton supplies from America have been cut off. And in 1863, Britain passes the Public Works Act. It's going to give relief, so give money to the out-of-work mill workers, but it wants them to do what it seems is useful work. So creating canals and roads and creating parks across the country.
This is very much what Roosevelt is going to do in the U.S. during the Great Depression 70 years later with the New Deal, right?
Yeah, people need money. You don't want to give people money for not working, so you create work for them to do. And there are amazingly relics of the work created during the cotton famine that are still there in Britain today. So if you go to Oldham, just near Manchester, and you go to Alexandra Park was created by out-of-work cotton mill workers during the cotton famine. But the most amazing thing is what's called the Cotton Famine Road. If you go north of the town of Rochdale in Lancashire, over Rawley Moor, there is a cobbled Victorian road. And it goes over the hills, and there's nothing on either side of you other than the moors. And it feels like a road to nowhere, unused today other than by hill walkers. But it is this Victorian cobbled street that looks like it should be in Notting Hill in London, over the moors. And it was created again, cut through those hills by out-of-work cotton workers.
So if you go and see the Cotton Famine Road, you are looking at the direct consequence of the American Civil War to the north of Rochdale.
Cut into the soil of Lancashire. There's another amazing connection, which left another relic that we'll get to, which links what was happening in America and what was happening in Britain. By the end of 1862, 485,000 people in Lancashire were living off charity, off the poor law, working in the public works. There was some disturbances. There were some small-scale riots.
You'd expect some resistance.
Yeah. The most famous of the disturbances was about the conditions of the relief. The suffering of the cotton workers was being reported in America. People in the northern states knew what was happening. They knew that this civil war was having effects in Britain.
Well, and they realized that it was their blockades that were causing the damage as well. We've been talking throughout the story about the ways in which the fates of Britain and the United States during the Civil War are intertwined in so many unexpected ways. But this part of the story is actually the Union, or New York in particular, recognizing that it was partly their responsibility. And so they decided they needed to do something about it.
That's exactly the right word. That sense of responsibility is inspired in part by a New York Times editorial that appears in November 1862, describing the conditions in Lancashire. And it leads a group of New York merchants to set up a relief organization, a charity. And they say that it is to help alleviate the suffering of the operatives of Lancashire, operatives because they operate the machinery, the cotton workers. And on the 10th of January, 1863, a ship called the George Griswold sailed from New York. Now, the owners of the ship did not charge for it being used. The dock workers of New York didn't charge for their time in loading the ship. The pilots who guided ships out of New York Harbor all worked for free. And on the 9th of February, 1863, that ship, the George Griswold, sailed up the Mersey to the docks of Liverpool.
So it's early 1863. It's only a little more than a year after the Trent Affair almost brings Britain and America to the brink of war. Popular opinion is furious at America. So how did they respond to this act of charity coming from America about 15 months later?
Yeah, it is an astonishing turnabout because on board the ship were 13,000 barrels of flour, along with large quantities of bacon and rice and corn. And what the dock workers and the transport workers of England matched what had happened in New York. The dock workers of Liverpool unloaded the ship for nothing. The railway companies transported this food for free. And this was humanitarian aid, food aid from America to Britain. And as you say, a year after these two nations had been on the brink of war, a year after those 14,000 articles about the Trent and about national honour had been in the British newspapers, it is an astonishing transformation, really.
And it's a lovely story. I mean, we're talking about war and we're talking about all these political calculations and carnage at Antietam. And then there are these really lovely stories about people rising to the occasion and trying to do the right thing and people being so generous. And those stories are so important for us to remember as historians and as we tell these stories. Having said all of that, I'm now going to point out that all of this, which was very genuine charity and very genuinely meant, it was also good propaganda for the Union.
Yeah, I mean, this was partly done because it was a great story, but it was also a recognition of the mill workers of Lancashire had supported the North against their economic interests. And that's the astonishing thing, because the riots that take place, the disturbances that there are during the cotton famine, are not demanding that the British government recognize the South and get the cotton flowing again. They're about the level and the conditions of the relief that they're being given. There is, not universal by any means, but there is support among the most economically vulnerable people in this story, other than the enslaved people, of course. The people who are really suffering are still of the opinion that this war, because it is now a war against slavery, is something that they support, even though it is in their economic interests to embrace the Confederacy, to say to hell with the slaves and slavery, and to get the cotton flowing again. It's one of those moments in British working class, British industrial history that many people find incredibly meaningful, because these are people who have a lot to lose doing things against their economic interests. And there's an astonishing relic, which I have seen and I've touched up in the museum up in Lancashire. And it's one of those 13,000 barrels, which has been preserved and it's been varnished.
They saved it.
Yeah. And written on it says, "I am one of the thousands that were filled with flour and sent by the free states of America on the ship George Griswold to the starving people of Lancashire, whose miseries were caused by the aggressive and civil war of the slave owners." There's the propaganda bit at the end. But it is capturing a moment when people in the northern states and people in the north of England, despite the economic costs, supported one another, because this was now a war against slavery. This was a war against the great moral issue of the 19th century.
Well, indeed. And so, as you say, as a PR effort, it's kind of a gimme. Yeah. And it worked, didn't it?
Yeah. And despite their own suffering, the cotton workers of Lancashire very, very publicly come out to express their support for Lincoln, the Free States, the North, against the South and against slavery. They wrote a famous letter to Abraham Lincoln in support of the Union and the cause of emancipation. It was addressed from the citizens of Manchester. And on New Year's Eve, 1862, thousands of them gathered in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester and passed a resolution expressing their support for Lincoln and their opposition to slavery.
And Lincoln responded.
Yeah.
He sent them a personal letter, right? Not just written by a secretary, but Lincoln's own letter addressed to the working men of Manchester. So, Lincoln is the great hero of Americans from many walks of life, but even he didn't always remember the women.
Yeah. But he praised the Lancashire workers for their support, and he called it an instance of sublime Christian heroism that has not been surpassed in any age or in any country. This was not a country that was going to support the Confederacy after letters to and from Abraham Lincoln. Now, not all mill workers, not all mill owners were anti-slavery. There were towns that supported the South. This was not universal. It's a beautiful moment. We need to recognize that, at the same time, not imagine that everybody involved in it was willing to put their economic interests above the interests of the enslaved people. But I think what it does show is that the cotton gamble, the great idea that cotton was the economic weapon that would force Britain's hand to support the South, that had been an absolute delusion.
And yet, it's still 1863. The war isn't over. And it turns out neither are the crises between Britain and the United States over the war, because after this beautiful moment of the Union and Britain coming together, the Confederate interests have not gone away, and they are still hard at work trying to undermine British neutrality.
Yeah, even at this point, even with the war being a war against slavery, even after the cotton famine, the Confederates and their agents in Europe do manage to confect another crisis in which an American ambassador threatens the British government again with war.
So let's take a break there, and we will come back and hear about the final crisis between Britain and America during the U.S. Civil War. So we've been talking throughout the story about the fact that there is scattered sympathy for the Confederacy in Great Britain, but there's one British city in particular where there is concentrated support for the Confederacy.
Yeah, there was one British city that was said to be the most Confederate city outside of the Confederacy, and that, to my terrible sadness, because it's a city I love, was Liverpool. Liverpool was the British end of the global cotton supply chain. It was said that there were Confederate flags fluttering over the Mersey in the 1860s. And to an extent, you can see why. Liverpool had grown rich, more rich, importing American slave-produced cotton than it had as Britain's number one slave trading port. It was at the center of the city's economy. The cotton bales landed in Liverpool. From there, they were distributed by canals, by rail, to the thousands of mills of Lancashire. It was at the heart of Liverpool's economy.
And it was also a city full of Americans from the southern states because of that, because there had been so much trade and exchange between the two.
There's more Southerners in Liverpool than any other city. There's more marriages between Liverpool families and Southern families than there is in any city. And it is inevitably the place where the South sets up its diplomatic isn't the right word. It's espionage effort. It's manipulation effort. It's efforts to try to use politics, to use money, to use trade, to use networks to influence Britain, and also to use the British economy to help its war effort. There is an unofficial American embassy in Liverpool. It is 19 Abercrombie Square, the home of the merchant Charles Perrault. When I was at university in Liverpool, I remember going into 19 Abercrombie Square because it was where you went to go to the Hardship committee if you had no money.
Seriously.
I went, and I remember
That's
going
ironic.
there. Yeah. I went in there to ask if they'd give me some money so I could get through the last term of my first year. And back then, the ceiling was covered with one of those kind of horrible 70s suspended ceilings with those kind of white tiles. After I graduated, the tiles were removed to show the original ceiling. And the original ceiling is a frieze that is an allegory of slavery in the ancient world. One of the old arguments, the British had used this and the Americans were still using it in the 1860s, was that we love the classical world. We love the Greeks and the Romans, but they had slavery. So slavery can't be bad. On the ceiling above the door is the palmetto tree, the state tree of South Carolina, which is where Charles Perrault came from. He was married into a Liverpool merchant family, and he was a figure in this southern Liverpool network that was based in Liverpool.
So unbeknownst to you, you were going as a university student to the Hardship committee to ask for support underneath an allegory defending slavery.
Yeah.
In America.
I think I might have got more money, had to be able to look up and make them feel bad about it. But yeah, there is an irony there. I'm not going to deny it. But it is Liverpool, and it is that network of Liverpool merchants, Liverpool traders and lawyers and their southern business partners that creates the final crisis between Britain and America in the very unspecial relationship that marks the years of the Civil War.
As we've been saying, running throughout the story of the Civil War, you can't understand the American Civil War properly if you don't understand the role that Union blockades of the South played in its outcome. And we said earlier that at first they weren't that effective, but over the course of the war, they got bigger and better and stronger.
Yeah, the Union Navy grows, the Union Navy becomes more effective, its strategy becomes more effective, and port by port, they blockade the South really effectively. But the British, and Liverpool merchants in particular, find ways round the blockade. Now, they never, ever managed to get anything like the levels of trade that existed before the war. But they do manage to smuggle guns and weapons and supplies into the South and get a tiny amount of cotton out. What happens is that normal ships leave Britain to go to British colonies in the Caribbean. And there, the goods they are carrying are moved onto special ships called blockade runners.
And the blockade runners, as the name implies, right, are specifically designed to evade the blockades because the ordinary ships are just too big, too slow. They can just get captured and intercepted too easily.
Blockade runners they're small, they're sleek, they're low in the water. They haven't got armaments because that would weigh them down too much. And they just rush. They make a run for the southern coast. Then they sail back to British ports in the Caribbean with some cotton, not very much because they're small, sleek ships and they can't carry very much. But the big thing is they import hundreds of thousands of guns into the south, which allows the Confederate army to stay armed. It probably extends the war, by months, if not years.
Yeah, probably a couple of years.
A couple of years is what many historians argue.
Now, of course, the people who are running the blockades are not only doing this in order to supply armaments to the south. Many of them are also doing it in order to profiteer off of the war. Some of them actually bank their profits from blockade running in Liverpool because it's safer there than obviously, in the risky Confederate economy.
There is a whole network in Liverpool of lawyers and bankers and facilitators who are enabling and allowing this to happen. And there's also a great amount of collusion. There's huge profits being made. This war is a boom to Liverpool, making up to a small extent for the loss in cotton income. But the South is not just banking the money from blockade runners in Liverpool. It's also building them. They're being made in shipyards on the Mersey. But it gets worse than that, and it gets deeper than that, and this is what causes the next and final crisis in the Civil War. Because in Liverpool, among the foreign agents working for the Confederacy is a man called James Bullock, a retired US Navy officer. And his job, effectively, is to build a Confederate Navy. They haven't got the technology. They haven't got the shipyards to build the ships that they need, but they know that they can buy them. They can get them off the shelf, built by British companies. And they have to find a way, in order to do that, a way round British law. The British Enlistment Act meant that it was illegal for British companies to build ships that would be used in a war against a nation that Britain was at peace with. So it wasn't legal.
That's a sensible policy.
Yeah. It was a way of staying out of wars. It was a way of maintaining neutrality. You don't allow combatants in a war to build warships in your country that are going to be used against a nation that you're at peace with, because it's going to drag you into the war. The British are trying to keep out, and this law predates the Civil War. The problem with this law is it's never been tested in court. And so James Bullock, with the help of a group of pro-Confederate Liverpool lawyers, begins a legal argument. When does a ship become a warship? What are the features of a ship that makes it a warship? And what they argue is a ship is not a warship until it is armed. This allows them to pay for and to get built in Liverpool ships that are warships in every regard other than that they have not had their weapons fitted. So they are ships with armor. They are ships that have been laid out with heavy decks to carry guns, but the guns have not been fitted. So you can build these ships in dockyards in Liverpool, then sail them out into neutral waters, then fit guns made in Britain that have been smuggled out to be fitted to those ships, and you have not broken the law. And this is what Bullock and the network of enablers in Liverpool's shipyards, Liverpool's banks, Liverpool's legal houses. This is what they do. In March 1862, a newly constructed ship, the Averting, leaves Liverpool.
And it crossed the Atlantic, reappeared in American waters, now carrying the British guns it had acquired en route, and it was renamed the CSS Florida.
So a Confederate ship.
Yeah, the CS Confederate States.
Yeah. And it had been built by a company, John Laird and Sons of Birkenhead. That is the town south of Liverpool on the south side of the Mersey. Now, Lincoln's government knew entirely what was going on. They had their own network of spies in Liverpool because they could see it was a kind of nest of Confederate activity. But they also knew that the British government was turning a blind eye to this. This was a technicality. These ships were clearly ships that were going to be warships. They just hadn't had the guns fitted. And the British, because this was profiteering, were allowing these ships to leave.
And so this is all happening in early 1862, as at the same time, the Trent Affair, which we heard about in the last episode, was coming to a head. So Lincoln also has his hands full and really doesn't want to pick a fight with Britain again over the CSS Florida.
Yeah. And it's as kind of people are calming down after the Trent and war's been averted, that attention turns again to the Laird shipyards again in Birkenhead opposite Liverpool, because in one of the docks is a ship that hasn't yet got a name. It's called Hull 290. And it is it's going to be a very powerful ironclad ship with reinforced decks, emplacements for guns, storage spaces below deck that look a hell of a lot like magazines where you would store ammunition.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. Hull 290 is obviously, manifestly a warship, and the guns are going to be fitted later. And the US Ambassador Adams completely knows this.
That name Adams is a familiar one in American history. They are one of our great dynasties. People today will, be familiar with the Bush dynasty, but the Adams family runs across the 18th and 19th century. And in fact, this Ambassador Adams was the grandson of John Adams, the United States second president, and he was the son of John Quincy Adams, our fifth president. So he has quite the pedigree.
Yeah. And he's also exceptionally competent, and he completely understands what's going on. And he's beginning to pressure the British government to force them to confront the fact that the building of these ships, although there is a technicality, a loophole in the law, is, in his view, a violation of British neutrality. And that pro-Confederate politicians and officials in London are working the system. They are playing. They are finding ways around of arming the Confederacy when Britain is supposedly a neutral nation.
And as you say, the British government is aware that this is going on.
Yeah. Adams is constantly writing to Foreign Secretary John Russell saying, you are making ships that are going to the Confederacy, that are destroying our shipping in violation of your neutrality. And yet he is not able, despite his protestations, to get the British government to block Hull 290 from leaving Liverpool. And it is next seen in the Caribbean now as the armed commerce raider, a ship that is going to sink commercial ships owned by the Union, the CSS Alabama, the most infamous, most famous ship in the whole story of the American Civil War. A British-made ship loaded with British guns and British ammunition, crewed mainly by British sailors.
Mm. Which is something that even I think Americans, we do hear about the CSS Alabama, but don't always realize that part of it. You assume it's Confederate sailors manning the CSS Alabama, but it's mostly British.
Yeah, there's a lot of Confederate officers, some of them very connected to people at the top of the Confederacy and the Confederate government. But the sailors, they're British, and they've signed on because, they're being paid well. And they start attacking Union ships. And for 2 years, the Alabama causes absolute havoc, not just in the ships it intercepts and sinks 65 Union ships attacked. It's the fact that it convinces other ships and other captains not to set sail. It leads to many American ships having to reflag themselves. It causes millions of dollars of damage to Union shipping.
So needless to say, the Union and supporters of the Union cause, who, as we've been saying, are on both sides of the Atlantic, are not happy about this situation.
People in the North are furious. Somebody who best expresses this is a woman who's one of the most famous people on earth in the 1860s, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she uses her kind of moral standing, as it were, this great author, this great abolitionist, to write an appeal to the Sisters of England.
Well, this is exactly the strategy that she used in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is an appeal to the Sisters of America, to the Sisters of the North. So she appeals to women in that novel saying slavery is evil because women had been at the center of the abolition movement. And she knew perfectly well that that was true again on both sides of the Atlantic. So asking British women in their kind of 19th century role as the custodians of Christian morality to condemn the complicity that was allowing the Alabama to do all this damage.
Yeah. I mean, Harriet Beecher Stowe was never known to underwrite.
True.
And she describes the Alabama as a war steamer built for a man-stealing confederacy with English gold in an English dockyard going out of an English harbor, manned by English sailors with the full knowledge of the English government. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, she is.
She makes her point.
Yeah. I mean, she was a really, really good propagandist. When she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, she sent it to Queen Victoria. She really knew how to influence British public opinion and how to speak to English womanhood. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm sorry. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but it is exactly the same tactic. She understood that it worked and that by directly appealing to these women, she could get them actually standing up and doing something about it. It is why apocryphally, but famously, she is described as the little.
We have to tell that story.
We have to tell the story, right? Which is, supposedly Lincoln said, "So you're the little woman who started this great war."
Yeah, he met her at the White House, I think.
Yeah, but he didn't say it, so that's been debunked by historians. But the sentiment is true.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that isn't true but should be.
It's completely true. And because Uncle Tom's Cabin did start the war, but as we're saying, or anyway, it's a proximate cause of the war. It wasn't the only thing, obviously. But what we're saying is that on both sides of the Atlantic, what she understands is that the appeal is to women to say, you must not let this happen.
Yeah. When she writes that letter, obviously the Alabama has, literally sailed. That ship has gone. However, there were 2 new ships being commissioned by James Bullock, then being built in Leeds, in Birkenhead, on the Mersey, 2 new ironclad warships, quite clearly warships. They're called the Laird Rams, and they were ships powerful enough when they were completed to draw Union ships away from the blockade. They would have the same sort of impact that the Alabama had had. And a new diplomatic battle starts. US Ambassador Adams gathers intelligence. This time he is determined to force the Palmerston's government to stop these ships.
He's not going to accept the loophole anymore because it's technicality, right? As we've been saying. So they've been trying to weasel out of it on a technicality, and he comes in and he's going to gather evidence that makes it clear that whether or not they have a gun on them at the moment they leave port does not actually affect whether they have been constructed as warships or not.
Yeah. And so on the 5th of September, 1863, Adams writes a note to the British Foreign Secretary, and he warns that if these 2 ships are allowed to leave, sail down the Mersey, head out to sea where they will inevitably be armed, and then the next stop is they will start destroying Union shipping. If they allow that to happen, as they had with the Alabama, that it would be really serious. And the last line of his note said, "It would be superfluous in me to point out to your lordship that this is war." So the American ambassador threatening the British government with war if these 2 ships are allowed to leave. And this time, after a note like that, the British government did intervene.
And this, again, just to remind listeners, this is less than 2 years after the Trent affair had come to a head. And once again, there is the threat of war. But the British government has learned its lesson, and okay, we're not going to get to the brink again. So what did they do?
Well, the British government entirely proved Adams's point that these are warships because it purchased them for the Royal Navy, rather kind of undermining any argument that they weren't warships. That decision, that intervention, under huge pressure from Ambassador Adams, ends the final great crisis between Britain and America in the American Civil War. And Laird's, the company that had built the Alabama and was building those 2 ships, was never prosecuted, despite the enormous damage that the Alabama had done to Union shipping. However, the British government was prosecuted.
Well, because the North was not about to forget the role that British ships had played because of what we've just been saying. I mean, they arguably prolonged the war, they captured Union ships, and so it was a breach of neutrality. And once the Union won the war, they weren't, prepared to overlook that.
I mean, the Alabama is really, really famous. I mean, for 2 years, it runs amok in the Atlantic. I mean, it is eventually sunk. And we were saying that, civil wars are far more global than you might imagine. The Alabama is sunk by an American ship off Cherbourg in France. So there's a sea battle off the coast of France, which is part of the American Civil War. And if the American government is willing to track the Alabama across the Atlantic Ocean, it's not going to forget the damage that it's done. And so there is a legal case after the war.
The legal case was for compensation for the damage that had been done by not only the Alabama, but the other British-built ships, the damage they had done and the cost that they had incurred and the ways in which they helped prolong the war. And they won.
Yeah, 1872, the British government settled, i.e. paid the American government $15.5 million in compensation for all of that damage, for having allowed these ships to be built in British shipyards to set sail with British guns and British sailors.
But $15.5 million in 1872, that's like $500 million today, maybe more, depending on how you calculate it. It's a lot of money.
And I think it also shows that we began this series talking about how central the American economy was to the British economy before the Civil War. It shows by the 1870s they just want to get back to that. They really, really understand that the economic fates of these two nations as America is growing and industrializing in the 1870s are deeply intertwined.
And that's really where the 20th century special relationship finally will emerge, as we were saying at the beginning of the story, is that there are conflicts over the course of the 19th century, over borders and whatever, but ultimately what's going to happen is that the interests of trade, of shared trade, are what are going to keep Britain and America at peace and as allies over the course of the 20th century into the 21st century so far, and we can hope will continue to do so, although things might get tense in the next couple of years.
But the Alabama claims that sort of settling of this debt, we're a long way from a special relationship, but it is the end of the really, really bad relationship that had obviously begun with the Revolution and the War of 1812 and the crises we've been talking about in the Civil War. That clearing of the tables, it really is a kind of critically important moment.
And that is the last crisis to date where Britain and the United States were at the brink of war in any kind of diplomatic crisis. There has not been anything like that since then, and we can hope, as I say, that there won't be one anytime soon.
Yeah. But it's interesting how much of this history has been forgotten. The fact that American secretaries of state and American newspapers talked about taking Canada over and making Canada a state of the United States, or many states of the United States. We've forgotten that. We've forgotten that tariffs are not a new phenomena, that nations have used tariffs against each other, and Britain and America have used tariffs against each other. At the beginning of this series, we talked about how the idea of the special relationship, that phrase of Churchill's from 1946, how we've projected that back into earlier decades where there really wasn't a special relationship. But if there's a moment when the modern relationship between Britain and America emerges, it really is the 1872, when the legacy of the Civil War is forgotten about because of this payment.
And that really is the last time that America and Britain would come to at least the last time to date, that America and Britain would come to the brink of conflict, that there would be any kind of diplomatic crisis. And then the relationship through trade, that friendship through trade that we were talking about in the beginning of the story, just solidifies throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, it's a relationship built on shared culture. It's a relationship built on mass migration from Britain. It's the foundations that's going to allow Britain and America in two world wars to be close allies in the 20th century.
And it's what enables us to forget so much of this history as well. In so many ways, British and American popular memories are going to be different. But this is one of the ones where it's pretty similar. We've both forgotten this part. Neither one of us tells these stories in our popular history about the conflict between Britain and America over the course of the 19th century. But they shaped, as we've been saying, so much of what came.
And that more recent history, that history of, whether we believe it or not, a special relationship, is why thousands of people have come to listen to an American president speak in London. It's why the idea of an American president and a British prime minister getting on planes and talking to each other is natural. It's second nature. And it's not that old a history.
And it's also why any sense of tension between the prime minister and the US president is genuinely unsettling to people on not just both sides of the Atlantic, but, people in different countries as well, because that sense of friendship now seems so stable and understood that when there are tensions, it's deeply, deeply destabilizing. It's not normal.
Because the norm is good relationships, and that was not the case in the 19th century. The norm was tensions and bad relationships. And the risk is, with human nature, that because something's normal, because we've got used to it, we think it's inevitable, that it is predestined, preordained, that Britain and America should be friends, should have close relationships. And what this history shows is that is not something we should take for granted.
I think that's perfectly put, David. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important that we do what we can to preserve that special relationship, to recognize its importance. And it's why moments like you interviewing President Obama in front of thousands of people in London today are so powerful and actually so important to all of us. So thank you for the story. Thank you for the interview. And we look forward to seeing everyone next time.
And we'll continue our special relationship on another subject in the next episodes.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.